This dresser that looks like it's from around the 1920s is covered in layers of paint, and I'm gonna bring it home to see if I can bring it back to its original beauty. This process is a massive pain in the ass. I got this piece on Facebook Marketplace for $45, and what drew me in is this part right here, this little drawer that opens sideways. I'm gonna try to preserve as much of this piece as possible, but I'm also going to try and repurpose the design a little bit to make it a little more practical for the modern day. That's the problem with a lot of old pieces of furniture, is that they just don't really have a place in most modern homes. One idea I have in mind right now is to turn it into a hallway console by adding a backboard with hooks for maybe jackets, keys, things like that. But first things first, we have to strip off this black paint. When I go into projects with a specific idea in mind, I usually end up changing my mind anyway, so I always try to keep an open mind to new ideas, especially for painted pieces like this where I just have no idea what it looks like underneath. I'm using a heat gun first to see if I can remove the paint easily, because it's something I've been wanting to try and it'll allow me to avoid stripping if it works well. If I can avoid stripping, I definitely like to, because it's a very messy procedure and removing paint off of an entire piece of furniture like this will eat through a full can of stripper. And in this economy, that's something I would like to avoid if possible. When I saw the paint bubble up like this, I was feeling very optimistic, but then it was immediately followed by disappointment. Yeah, I don't think this is gonna work.
Hi, we're going to talk about stripping paint. This is not a fast process. Wow, look at that.
Okay, so after learning how to actually do this properly, I realized that I was holding the gun too far away from the paint, and I didn't scrape it off right away because I stood up to grab my scraper after heating it. So in that time, I think it cooled down, and that's the reason it didn't scrape off very well. This black paint came off pretty easily, but this green primer underneath, not so much. I'm afraid that if I heat up this green layer too much, it's actually gonna bond with the wood underneath it even more. So I think what I'm gonna do is remove the black layer with the heat gun, but then use a paint stripper for the layer underneath. I don't think I'll be able to avoid using paint stripper for this one. I believe this piece is an Art Deco dresser from the 1920s, and I'm not against painting furniture, but I think these Art Deco pieces in particular always look amazing in their original unpainted state, and that's kind of why I bought this piece. I'm hoping that once I remove all this paint, it's gonna be worth the struggle. Speaking of 1920s, this video sponsored June's Journey is set in the 1920s, and it's a game where you solve mysteries by finding hidden objects. You play as June Parker in a quest to solve the murder of her sister, which sets her off on an unpredictable adventure where she uncovers her family's many secrets. You progress through the story by searching through these really well-crafted scenes for hidden objects, some of them serving as a clue that pushes the mystery further. Every time you find an object, it adds to the score multiplier, which keeps stacking as long as you don't drop it. I like to attempt to finish the whole scene without losing the multiplier, which is actually really hard to do. There's no time limit for these scenes, so you can take your time if you want, but I just like to challenge myself. Aside from the mystery solving, there's another aspect of the game where you work on customizing and remodeling your mansion and garden on your island. Decorating lets you level up, which unlocks new scenes for you to explore. It's a really fun gameplay loop that had me coming back. It's got amazing reviews, and it's available on iOS, Android, and on PC. So if you're a fan of solving true crime mysteries, try June's Journey for free by downloading it using the link in the description. Okay, change of plans. I'm just gonna strip this whole thing because this process is a massive pain in the ass. I don't know what this green stuff is, but it's extremely unsatisfying to strip. My next plan was to try another round of stripper, but this time leaving it for an hour instead of 20 minutes. I also covered it with plastic wrap, which helps reduce evaporation of the stripper and yields better results. I wanted to make sure to get a proper go at this green stuff before giving up on it.
1 hour later.
You can see how the black paint does that alligator skin thing where it looks soaked and peels right off in a satisfying, content-worthy way. But this green layer... Okay, I think with this green stuff, I'm just gonna have to sand it. It just looks too soupy, and I don't think stripper's gonna do the trick very cleanly. Sanding is never completely avoidable because even after a flawless strip job, you still have to sand to get the wood grain clean. It just sucks that it looks like there's gonna be a lot more of this green paint layer that I'm gonna have to sand than I would have liked. But on the bright side, this black paint was a very thin layer and was coming off with very little stripper, and cases like this is actually where stripping is so much more efficient than sanding. This black paint looks like oil paint, and it's the type that will really gum up your sandpaper and be a massive pain to sand off despite it being such a thin layer. Not only did this green layer not want to strip for me, but it also was the type to really gum up the sandpaper. And that's when I remembered that I can try using my scraper. And I say remembered because I had literally forgotten about the existence of this tool up until this point. The scraper did a pretty good job of removing most of the paint. I'll still have to sand as a final step, but it saves me a ton of time and sandpaper this way. I was happy to finally start seeing some of the original wood, but then I ran into another obstacle. Okay, so one small problem is that this wood is a plywood with a wood grain film applied on top of it. And if you look closely, you can see that the paint is embedded pretty much through the thickness of the entire film, so I can't sand it away completely clean without burning through the film. And a professional would never make that kind of mistake, so strictly for demonstration purposes, future me will figure something out.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
I think there's a pretty good chance that I won't be using this backsplash and be replacing it with something else, so I'm just gonna take it off for now and not bother restoring it. I'm looking and I don't see any signs of screws or nails. I'm thinking the top might be attached with just glue. So with this top section, my main concern is this corner that's really damaged. So instead of trying to fix that, I think what I'm gonna do is just replace this entire top section with a new piece of solid wood. I think once we get this frame off, we'll be able to see what kind of hinge mechanism we have going on underneath here. I accidentally splintered the side while taking off the top here, but luckily I did not lose the splinter. I'll just sand that smooth when it's dry and it'll be like it never happened. I continued to use a scraper to get the majority of the paint off and then finished with the sander. For the nooks and crannies, the box cutter did pretty well for me. The part that I was dreading the most though was this trim right here. These detailed trims are always the trickiest and most time consuming to restore because you have to really finesse your way into the tight spaces and get creative with your methods, while also taking into account the grain direction of the wood. After I got the bulk of the paint scraped off, I brushed on some paint stripper, waited maybe about 10 minutes, and then used this steel brush to brush off the paint. This worked pretty well. I was able to just wipe away the goop, and this is actually what I ended up doing for this middle panel, which had the same plywood plus veneer combo as the side. The brush does a pretty good job of getting into those tiny pores in the veneer and scraping out the paint. This is a step that always comes after using paint stripper. I soak a shop towel with some paint thinner and then wipe down any surface that was stripped to clean off any residue, and then I just let it dry. Out of all the steps involved in restoring this piece, this part right here was probably the most tedious. These little crevices were so small that even a folded piece of sandpaper was too thick to get all the way in there. So I went back to the box cutter to painfully scrape out all the paint. This is the splinter that I repaired earlier. After sanding it clean, you can't even really tell that it was there. And then it was finally time for me to deal with this side that I over-sanded. About a year ago, I did a restoration of this pharmacy cabinet, and the whole thing was made of plywood, which typically doesn't look great in any given living room. So what I did was I applied this veneer over it, and this is a pre-glued veneer, so all you have to do is slowly run an iron over it, which emulsifies the glue and it sticks to the surface. I had some leftover veneer after that project, so I applied the same principle of if it doesn't look the best, put veneer over it to this project. Something strange I didn't realize until now is this does not look the same as this. Somebody must have chopped it for some reason. For building the top, I'm going to use this salvaged oak tabletop that I have. One thing about using these salvaged pieces of wood is that you often have to trim the edges to make a clean edge, and you also have to sand off the existing finish. But that's an infinitely small price to pay for using these salvaged pieces of wood over buying a new solid wood. Okay, now I want to mimic the shape of this original top, and for that I need a roundover router bit. I have one roundover bit, but this one's a 1/4 inch radius, and I think for this shape I'll need a 1/2 inch radius. So I think I'm gonna run to Home Depot and buy one. The router is one of the tools in my shop that I dislike using the most, and it's not because it's the loudest tool in my shop, it's not because it's the dustiest, but it's because I just hate replacing these bits whenever I need to use it. I don't know why, it doesn't even take that long, I just don't like this process at all. This is a lot of material that I'm removing, so I went with multiple small passes to avoid too much strain on the router bit. Before I can attach these tops, I need to work on these drawers separately. In other words, I need to stain them first, because once the top goes on, these drawers are stuck there for good. The stain I'm using for this piece is a gel stain in Provincial, which is one of my favorite colors. Gel stain is probably one of the easiest and most forgiving types of stains, for a few reasons. One is that because it's not liquidy, it doesn't run or drip even on vertical surfaces, making it really easy to apply, which is the second reason, how easy it is to apply. You can wipe it on with a rag, a sponge, a brush. My favorite method though is putting a sock over my hand and just wiping it on that way. Because of the gel stain's consistency, it doesn't soak as deeply into the wood as a liquid stain. You don't have to worry as much as with water stain, for example, of having some spots soak up more stain than others and having a blotchy result. After the first coat of stain, you can see how the side that I put veneer over is lighter than the rest of the piece of furniture. This is something I did expect because the veneer is a lighter wood than the rest of the piece, but the solution is simple. I just have to hit it with a second coat of stain using a darker color and try to match the tone as closely as I can to the rest. For attaching the top to the body, I decided to use metal brackets. And typically I'm not a fan of using metal brackets because I think it takes away from the vintageness of it. But in this case, I feel like I didn't really have a choice because I need this top to be very secure. And the way the original top was secured was with nails. But since I don't have the luxury of being able to cover a nail with paint, my only option is to screw in from the bottom. And while I had the piece laying on its back, I decided to replace the foot felt with something new. The old felt actually wasn't in terrible condition, but it never hurts to have some new shoes. I plan on sealing this piece using a polyurethane, but before I can do that, the stain needs to be completely dry. It took about 2 days for the stain to dry, and that gave me enough time to work on the handles. If the router is my least favorite tool in my shop, the bandsaw is my most favorite. It's quiet, produces relatively little dust, and it's quiet. It's also just fun tracing out these small detailed jobs with this tool. sealing with polyurethane is always a very satisfying process because you can see the wood go from a very dry looking look to a much more saturated, moist look. Oh, and you know how I said that I would try to repurpose the function of this piece at the beginning? I think somewhere along the way I decided not to and just leave it as is. And that's kind of what I meant when I said I like to keep an open mind, because as I stripped the paint off this piece, I started to really see how nice it was underneath, and it almost becomes a shame to change it up. So if you were waiting to see what I was gonna do to the piece, sorry. But if you want to check out a more extreme makeover that I've done, check out this video. Thanks so much for watching.